Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into this, well, kind of unusual figure, Søren Kierkegaard.
Unusual, yeah, I like that.
He was a 19th century thinker, and he really grappled with, like, the big questions, like, what does it even mean to really live? Not just exist, but truly live. And we've got your text here, which lays out his life and his ideas in a really fascinating way.
Yeah, it's a great read.
So for this deep dive, I think our mission is to unpack what Kierkegaard was getting at. What does it mean to authentically experience life? And how do we choose to live it, knowing all the complexities and uncertainties?
Right, yeah, and all through his lens, which is so intensely personal, so focused on the individual.
Exactly. He called it our existing self, which is, well, kind of different from how a lot of philosophers before him were approaching these questions.
Totally, and that's what makes him so interesting. He was really onto something that took a while for the rest of the world to catch up with.
Absolutely. In fact, the text points out that, he pretty much flipped the script on philosophy as it was being done at the time. Instead of searching for these universal truths out there, he said, no, the real action is happening within each of us, in our subjective experience.
It was a huge shift.
Yeah.
And it kind of blew people's minds. It was like, wait, what? It's all about me.
Yeah.
My individual experience is the key.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, as you mentioned earlier, it laid the groundwork for, what we now call existentialism.
Right. Think about Jean-Paul Sartre, post-World War II Paris. People struggling with meaninglessness, nihilism. I mean, Kierkegaard was diagnosing that almost a century earlier.
Well, 100 years ahead of his time.
It's incredible, really. And he offered this idea that meaning isn't something you just find lying around. You create it. You actively choose it through the way you live.
So speaking of catching on, the text mentions that while figures like Nietzsche, Husserl, even Heidegger are now linked to existentialism.
Heidegger, though, always rejected that label.
Of course he did. But anyway, Kierkegaard's contemporaries pretty much gave him a pass.
Yeah, across the board. Philosophers, theologians, psychologists, they just weren't really into it.
But then, boom, the 20th century hits and existentialism explodes from those Parisian cafes.
Which, by the way, were pretty much the original social media.
So true. And then it spreads to Greenwich Village, London, San Francisco's beatnik scene.
It becomes this really weird blend of highbrow philosophy and counterculture.
Right. Appealing to all sorts of people, thinkers, artists, rebels.
And as the text rather cheekily points out, probably a fair share of posers, too.
So zooming out for a sec, I think what's really crucial here is that Kierkegaard was revisiting this really fundamental question, what is existence?
A question that, had kind of fallen out of fashion in philosophy.
Right. The text reminds us that the pre-Socratics were all over this. They were obsessed with understanding being, the nature of existence itself.
But then Socrates comes along with his whole know thyself thing, and things take a different turn.
It's like philosophy became more about rational self-knowledge and ethics, but not so much about, the raw experience of existing.
Precisely. And that's what Kierkegaard wanted to bring back into focus.
Yeah. And it's so interesting how the text points out that this led to the question of being basically ignored for centuries. Like Plato, for example, just seemed to accept existence as a given. It was like, okay, we're here, let's move on to more important stuff.
It's funny, isn't it? Like, oh yeah, existence, whatever. Let's talk about virtue.
But even though Plato kind of brushed it aside, it didn't mean the question went away for the rest of us, did it?
Not at all. We're still wrestling with it. What does it mean to be? And that's what makes Kierkegaard so relevant, even today.
Now, the text does mention that later thinkers tried to, circle back to this idea of the self.
Oh, yeah. Descartes, for instance. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He brought that subjective I back into the spotlight.
Yeah. But, as the text notes, it was primarily intellectual, existing in the act of thinking. So, feelings, perceptions, they were kind of left out.
Then you've got Kant trying to build this huge system based on reason, trying to fit this subjective self into some kind of larger structure. And then, of course, you have Hegel.
Hegel with his even grander system.
Right. The idea that everything rational is real and everything real is rational.
So they were all trying to grapple with this notion of the self, but as the text suggests, they didn't really answer Kierkegaard's question, what is existence? It's like these systems, they just sort of assumed that the world was rational and offered rational answers.
Which, is a pretty big assumption.
Huge. And Kierkegaard, he was like, hold on a second, it's not that simple. He felt that the I, the subjective self, existed beyond pure reason.
Absolutely. For him, the answer wasn't in building some perfect all-encompassing system.
Right, because life is messy. It's full of contradictions and emotions and all this stuff that doesn't fit neatly into a rational box.
And it's those messy bits that Kierkegaard wanted to explore. The stuff that makes us human, that makes us who we are.
Okay, so let's dive into Kierkegaard himself. The text tells us he was born in Copenhagen in 1813, same year as Richard Wagner. And the text kind of cleverly positions them as these contrasting figures, like embodying opposite ends of the 19th century spirit.
Right, Kierkegaard, the introvert, the deep thinker. Wagner, the showman, the master of spectacle.
And apparently Kierkegaard was pretty much the anti-Wagner and vice versa. The only thing they really shared, this, a touch of what the text calls madness. It seems like it was almost a prerequisite for genius back then.
Yeah, that whole tortured artist thing.
Totally. And Kierkegaard's madness, it wasn't the, institutional kind.
No straitjackets or anything.
Right. But it showed up in these persistent eccentricities, these, unusual behaviors. The text really emphasizes his lifelong solitude and this really heavy influence of his father.
Oh, the father. It's almost Shakespearean, the way his presence looms over Kierkegaard's entire life.
Yeah. The text describes his influence as despotic, like really controlling.
And you can see how so much of who Kierkegaard became was either a direct result of his father or a reaction against him.
It's almost like he couldn't escape his father's shadow.
Right. And the father's backstory is, wild. He starts out as a servant in rural Jutland and, get this, he curses God.
Whoa.
Yeah, in a moment of despair. But then, total reversal of fortune. He becomes this wealthy merchant in Copenhagen. So you've got this family history soaked in religious intensity. And as he gets older, the father's growing depression.
So this backdrop sets the stage for young Søren's, very unusual education.
That's like something out of a Dickens novel.
Totally. The text details these intense logic lessons starting at age 7. Like his father would just pick apart everything he said.
Oh, I can only imagine. Talk about pressure.
And then there were these elaborate imaginary travels all confined to his father's study. Like he'd have to vividly describe these faraway places he'd never actually seen.
Wow. So on the one hand, you can see how this really developed his logical mind and his imagination. But on the other hand...
it's like his father was projecting his own despair onto his son.
Right. And there's that quote from the father's diaries, "Poor child, you live in silent despair." I mean, that's just heartbreaking.
Yeah. Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And this intense, unusual upbringing, it definitely shaped Kierkegaard's early years. The text mentions how he was described as an old man in school. In his appearance and demeanor.
It's like he was born with the weight of the world on his shoulders.
And even though he was obviously bright, his father made him deliberately place third in his class.
What? Why?
To avoid attention, to not stand out. It's so strange.
It really speaks volumes about the family dynamics,
For sure. Later on, at the University of Copenhagen, he starts studying theology, and he seems to be doing well. He's known for his wide knowledge, his sharp wit, but then his interests shift.
Toward philosophy.
And he gets really into Hegel.
Hegel, the philosophical rock star of the day.
But as the text makes clear, this was a very push-pull relationship. It was full of both admiration and opposition, like a real dialectic.
Makes sense, right? I mean, Kierkegaard, with his focus on the individual, couldn't fully buy into Hegel's grand system of the absolute spirit.
Right. He felt like self-knowledge had to be personal, subjective, that for individuals, that was way more important than some abstract, all-encompassing spirit.
And then, boom, things get even more complicated. There's this major shift in his relationship with his father.
Triggered by some serious confessions.
Not just like, oh, I stayed out too late. We're talking heavy stuff. Possibly the father's curse on God, infidelity.
And some scholars even think maybe syphilis.
Wow. So this period clearly had a huge impact on Kierkegaard. The text mentions this phase of, what was seen at the time as dissolute behavior.
Right, like a visit to a brothel that went, not well.
Not well at all. And what's so fascinating is how the text suggests that all this suffering, including, probably impotence, actually deepened his understanding of the human condition.
It's like his own pain became this source of insight into the struggles of being human.
Exactly. And that brings us to either.
His breakthrough work.
Where he really lays out his philosophical project.
And the text explains that under these different pen names, he presents these two fundamental ways of living, the aesthetic life and the ethical life.
It's like he's saying, okay, folks, here are your choices. Choose wisely.
Right. And these choices have huge consequences for how we exist, for our responsibility, for our understanding of ourselves.
These are the seeds of existentialism right here.
Yeah.
Forcing us to confront how we choose to be in the world.
So the aesthetic life, it's all about like immediate pleasure, engaging with the external world. And the text points out that this isn't necessarily superficial.
No, not at all. It could be someone dedicated to, like, curing cancer.
Yeah.
But if their main motivation is the personal satisfaction they get from it,
That's still aesthetic.
right, it's about what you're getting out of it for yourself, not some higher purpose.
And, in our modern world, it's hard to argue that we're not all in some way chasing pleasure and gratification.
Oh, for sure. We're bombarded with messages about, treat yourself, you deserve it, live your best life.
But Kierkegaard, as the text notes, he was pretty critical of this whole aesthetic viewpoint. I mean, he'd lived that kind of student life himself, and you can sense the guilt he felt about it later on.
Yeah, like, been there, done that, not worth it.
And the core issue he identifies is that someone living an aesthetic life, they lack control. They're driven by external forces, by these fleeting pleasures.
Like they're adrift in a sea of sensations.
And that can be really unsettling because, what happens when the pleasure fades? What happens when you can't get that next hit of dopamine?
That's when the despair sets in.
And the text points out that this despair, it can manifest in all sorts of ways. It can be repressed, ignored, even hidden behind like a respectable middle-class life.
Or, in a kind of twisted way, some people might even see this despair as like the meaning of their life.
Yeah, like finding a weird comfort in its certainty.
Which is, pretty bleak.
Super bleak. And this is where Kierkegaard really gets into the psychology of it all. Like how we deceive ourselves, how we build these layers of illusion to avoid facing this underlying despair.
And it's brilliant because he's drawing on his own experiences.
Yeah.
Rejecting his earlier beliefs.
So he's not just preaching from some ivory tower, he's been in the trenches.
Exactly. And he's trying to, guide us out of this abyss of despair.
Toward a life where we take responsibility, where we make conscious choices.
And this is where the ethical life comes in.
Okay, so let's break that down. What does the ethical life look like?
Well, the text explains that in the ethical life, subjectivity becomes the absolute. Like the individual's choices, their will, that's what matters most.
So it's about self-creation, right?
Totally. The ethical individual, they actively create themselves through their choices.
Mm-hmm.
And this self-creation, it becomes the very purpose of their existence.
It's like instead of just accepting who you are, you're constantly striving to become a better version of yourself.
And the text is careful to point out that the motivation for this ethical choice, it's kind of tricky.
Right. Like, why would someone choose to live ethically in the first place? What's the driving force?
Kierkegaard seems to assume that self-knowledge will inevitably lead to this desire for a higher life that will naturally gravitate towards what's good and right.
But, as the text notes, 20th century psychology has kind of thrown a wrench in that assumption.
Yeah, we're a lot more complicated than Kierkegaard maybe gave us credit for.
But anyway, the ethical individual, they move beyond the, randomness and inconsistency of the aesthetic life.
Right. They start operating within these universal categories like good and evil, duty, responsibility.
They become part of a larger moral framework.
Exactly. But the text does point out that Kierkegaard's explanation of how this transition happens, it's not entirely convincing.
It's like, how do we get from the absolute of our own subjectivity to this, universal system of life?
It's kind of a leap, and Kierkegaard doesn't fully bridge the gap.
But, I mean, his basic distinction between the aesthetic and the ethical, it's still pretty powerful.
Oh, for sure. The aesthetic, it's external, contingent, inconsistent, self-dissipating. The ethical, it's internal, necessary, consistent, self-creative.
And while, yeah, we can never live a purely ethical life.
Right, there's always going to be that messy external element.
This distinction highlights this fundamental tension in how we choose to orient our lives. Are we going to chase pleasure or are we going to strive for something more?
And that tension, I think, is something that we all feel in one way or another.
Absolutely. Now, this inherent dissatisfaction within the ethical life itself, the text explains, leads Kierkegaard to propose a third stage, a synthesis of the aesthetic and the ethical. And this is where things get really interesting.
This is where we enter the realm of the religious.
Right. This is explored in Fear and Trembling, which he wrote under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio. And here, the concept of faith becomes central.
Faith. But not faith as like blind belief or dogma.
Right, it's something much deeper.
It's the ultimate subjective act.
A leap beyond rational justification.
It has nothing to do with ethics or good behavior.
It's this like total surrender to something greater than ourselves.
Exactly. And the ethical life, with its emphasis on self-creation and responsible choice, it just can't fully accommodate this leap of faith.
Because this higher irrationality, as the text calls it, it lies beyond the ethical.
Right. Ethics demands rational conduct, but faith requires something else entirely.
And for Kierkegaard, faith connects the individual to the source of all that is ethical.
It's like the ethical life is religion in a social sense, but the truly religious life requires what Kierkegaard calls a teleological suspension of the ethical.
In other words, we have to set aside our ethical standards to transcend them and achieve this higher purpose.
And he uses the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac to illustrate this.
Oh yeah, the story where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son.
Which, from an ethical standpoint, is just horrifying.
Totally. But true faith, according to Kierkegaard, involves this divine purpose that overrides, that supplants all merely ethical demands.
So Abraham's willingness to obey God's command, no matter how repugnant it is to him personally, represents living at this religious level.
And Kierkegaard argues that this is superior to the ethical life because it has faith in the very source from which ethics itself comes.
Now, I know a lot of people are going to find this a very challenging idea.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. I mean, religious extremism throughout history has shown us the dangers of this kind of thinking.
Big time.
But I think the key here, as the text suggests, is to see this as an internal struggle.
Not necessarily a public act.
Right. Like it's a dialogue within the individual soul. And if we interpret Abraham and Isaac as different aspects of the same person, it becomes, I think, a lot more palatable.
It's like the sacrifice, which is often irrational and goes against everything we think is right, it becomes necessary to achieve a deeper purpose or to, fully commit to a belief.
And the text connects this to, like, how anyone gives their life a deep sense of meaning by believing in themselves as something. An artist, a politician, a comedian, whatever. It's that absolute commitment that makes the difference.
Okay, so moving into Kierkegaard's later years, the text depicts him living an increasingly solitary existence, almost entirely devoted to writing. He kind of withdraws from social circles and becomes this eccentric figure in Copenhagen.
With his distinctive clothes and, that whole intense vibe.
Yeah, but even in this isolation, he keeps writing under all these different pseudonyms, and his ideas keep evolving, especially his analysis of existence, which, as the text emphasizes, becomes super important for the development of existentialism.
Right, because for Kierkegaard, existence was fundamentally irrational. It was what's left after you've analyzed everything else. It's just like being there.
But, as he argued, when we really examine our own existence, we find it's more than just being there.
It needs to be lived, transformed into action through what he called subjective thought.
Which leads to subjective truth. This is where we get to his famous assertion that subjectivity is truth.
Boom. Mic drop.
Right. And the text explains that for Kierkegaard, there were two types of truth. Objective truth, which is about the external world, verifiable by external criteria, and subjective truth, which depends on how something is said, like the passion, the commitment behind it.
And he illustrates this with the example of two men praying. One's praying to, like, the true conception of God, but with a false spirit, while the other, a pagan, is praying to some idol, but with total passion.
And Kierkegaard says the pagan possesses greater subjective truth because he's praying in truth.
Right. It's not about being objectively correct. It's about the sincerity, the depth of feeling behind the belief.
And these subjective truths, they're so important for Kierkegaard because they're linked to our very existence.
They lack objective criteria, and they're tied to that irrational element that remains after we've analyzed everything else.
So, subjective truth, it's about the foundation of our values. It's not whether they're right or wrong, but the nature of our commitment to them.
And this connects to the philosopher David Hume, who argued that you can't derive an ought from an is.
Right, that morality can't just be deduced from objective facts.
But Kierkegaard takes it even further. He questions Hume's view that facts are primary.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The text points out that for Kierkegaard, even so-called facts can be shaped by our attitude. Like our values determine the facts we perceive.
It's like a Christian and a hedonist looking at the same reality might see very different facts.
Exactly. So, in a way, each individual is creating their own world, shaped by their chosen values.
Which is like a very early glimpse into what would later become phenomenology.
And this line of thinking, it contains the seeds of modern relativism, too. The idea that there's no single objective truth.
Kierkegaard was way ahead of his time.
So all this focus on individual perspective and the uncertainty of existence, it leads to his concept of anxiety or angst.
Angst. The word that gets thrown around a lot. But for Kierkegaard, it had a very specific meaning.
It wasn't just like everyday worry.
No, it was this deep existential dread that arises from the awareness of our freedom and the fact that we can never be absolutely certain that we're making the right choices.
Right, because those subjective truths, they don't have any solid foundation.
They're built on nothing. And that nothingness, that's the source of the anxiety.
It's like life is fundamentally tentative and illusory.
It's like standing at a crossroads with a million paths, not knowing which one to take.
And the text mentions his book, The Concept of Anxiety, which was this groundbreaking pre-Freudian psychological work.
Where he distinguishes between fear, which is a response to a specific threat, and anxiety, which is this more diffuse existential dread.
And he argues that the anxiety arises from the overwhelming possibilities of our own freedom.
Because when we become conscious of that freedom, we see how enormous it is.
Yeah.
And how irrational.
And as the text quotes him, it is impossible to prove that we have freedom because that proof would involve logical necessity, which is the opposite of freedom.
So it's this paradox.
Yeah.
We experience this freedom, but we can't prove it logically.
And this freedom, for Kierkegaard, it's not some abstract philosophical concept. It's a psychological reality.
It's something we feel in our gut.
And the anxiety that it generates, it's the terror at the heart of all normality.
Because if we fully confront it, it can lead to madness.
In his proposed escape, that irrational leap of faith, where we connect our subjective inner being to something greater than ourselves.
To God, in his case.
Okay, so in his final years, the text describes Kierkegaard becoming even more confrontational. He starts addressing religious matters directly, under his own name. No more pseudonyms.
It's like he's throwing down the gauntlet.
And his critique of the Church of Denmark in the moment, it caused a huge scandal.
But even amidst all that, he has this final encounter with Regine.
His old flame.
And they have this brief, poignant exchange.
Yeah.
A farewell.
Shortly after that, his health declines, and he dies in 1855. And, it's kind of fitting that even his funeral was marked by controversy.
A big crowd, but also a protest against the church.
Classic Kierkegaard. Even in death, he's stirring things up.
What's remarkable is how he went from being relatively obscure to becoming this hugely influential figure in the 20th century.
Right. The text highlights his influence on Husserl's phenomenology, on Heidegger.
Even though Heidegger tried to distance himself from existentialism.
Of course. And, ultimately, Kierkegaard's emphasis on subjective truth, on the individual's experience, on the anxiety of freedom, it left a lasting mark on philosophy. So, to wrap it all up, Kierkegaard outlined these three stages of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic, focused on external pleasures, leads to despair because it lacks meaning and control. The ethical, where we strive for self-creation within a moral framework, offers a path to a more fulfilling life, but it still leaves us wanting more. And the religious, which involves this leap of faith, this surrender to something beyond ourselves, well, that's where things get really complicated. And as we've seen, this leap of faith, it can be interpreted in many different ways.
And while the story of Abraham and Isaac raises some serious ethical questions, it can also be seen as a metaphor for the sacrifices we make for our deepest beliefs and values.
And as we navigate our own lives, facing uncertainty and grappling with the consequences of our choices, Kierkegaard's words resonate. Subjectivity is truth.
And life must be lived forwards, but can only be understood backwards.
So, as you go about your day, think about Kierkegaard's perspective. What does it mean for you to authentically exist in the face of such profound uncertainty? What kind of leap of faith might you be called to make in your own life?
It's a question worth pondering.
Absolutely.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Kierkegaard.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.
Bye.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.